Hey folks, and give it another minute and see if others get joined in. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and get started. The recording's automatically going. So this is the November 12th meeting of the working group LTS for the Kubernetes community. This is a community meeting. We ask that everybody adhere to our code of conduct as always and be good people, foster collaborative communication and conversation constructively. So, nothing specific is on the agenda, but we've been hashing back and forth this draft proto-KEP. So I'm assuming we will kind of continue on into that. And then 2 weeks ago, had wanted to talk a bit about Jordan's KEP on conformance without alpha APIs or alpha and beta APIs. I'd be curious to hear an update on that. And are there any other topics that folks would like to talk about this week? Survey statistics. Yeah, that's something that a number of us were re-looking at again. Josh has dropped that in the notes. Anything else from anybody? All right, well, in that case, let's go ahead and dive in. So Josh, do you want to talk about what you were seeing in the statistics first?
Yeah, so I was hoping to be further along by this meeting. Given the SurveyMonkey format and the number of questions that we asked, I'm still working on normalizing the data so that I can actually do summary statistics, et cetera, over it. So I'll have that done later today, but I don't have it done now. What I will say from looking at it is we did actually ask some questions where if those questions if the answers show strong trends, we would get an answer to the 12-month question. So the first question I'm trying to answer out of our survey is, would extending patch horizon to 12 months plus benefit a big chunk of our users? And the questions that I think would relate to that, number one would be looking at which versions people are using from that grid of versions that we allowed people to fill in. One of the questions I had was, I wasn't quite clear on the timing. When we put out the survey, was 113 released, or was it still in beta?
Just as the survey came out, 113 was coming out. So we started the survey in December of last year, and 113 came out, I think it was the first week of December. So they both kind of launched right around the same time.
Okay. Yeah, so that leads some vagueness, because obviously there's a qualitative difference then in the answers that we got in late January versus the answers that we got when the survey came out. But we do have, I'll double check that I have timestamps on each of those responses, because I can skew based on the timestamps. So anyway, if we look at it and we see that there's like this big hump of people using a version that is 4 releases ago, then that's a an argument in favor of the 12-month. Correlating that, though, with the question of where people get their binaries, which we also asked. So I think we can get, if there is signal there, then we will have evidence, right? And the signal requires a strong correlation in one direction or the other, right? Either we have a large number of people who are using upstream binaries and are using a version that is 3 to 4 releases old, or we don't have people using a version that's 3 to 4 releases old, or the people who are all using vendor binaries already. Between those two, from a direct user perspective, we would not have a sort of strong impulse saying either we would or wouldn't have a strong impulse. And then, of course, the other thing is to comb the comments for keywords. So I may do a dump of the comments this week because that is a human thing. And if anybody wants to volunteer to look for that, for people saying things that would support or not support the KEP or other KEPs based on people's comments, that would be helpful.
So in the agenda minutes, I dropped a link to the slide where we'd previously captured some of that. And what it shows is, so depending again on that skew within the 113 period, but definitely as 113 became available, 110 had fallen out of support. And then as 113 progressed, 111 was getting towards the end of its support. So in the first column on that chart, you've got, I don't know, maybe 240 respondents and their response from version 1.5 up to 113. So if you consider just 110 and older as the ones out of support, it looks like there's maybe 80 respondents out of 240, so about 30%. But if you factor in 111 as the one going out of support as 113 comes in, you'd practically double that number.
Yeah, and then the question is, the other thing that corresponds with that is, where do those people get their binaries? Mm-hmm. Right? Because with the caveat that there are probably people out there who would like to be using upstream binaries and aren't, specifically because of the support question, right?
Maybe.
So so anyway, I'm going to do some number crunching on that, and I have that today or tomorrow, so that we can be better informed by the time we have our LTS session at the Contributor Summit.
I've been trying to dig at the field around where they get their binaries, and I'm just trying to pull up my spreadsheet where I was doing that. So we asked a set of questions around, are you using upstream built binaries, self-built, unmodified or modified binaries, vendor built binaries, or other? And things are initially looking kind of evenly split across those, which is a bit of a surprise. Maybe some of the two feels like a fairly flat spread. People are very much using the upstream built containers, and the other built, something that didn't fall into these scenarios, unsure what that would be, is a bit lower than the other buckets, but it feels like a fairly level spread there. What I wanted to do next is cross-correlate that versus operator, user, contributor, that set of things that we had asked about as well.
I think when I was looking at that data, I was kind of getting confused on, hey, we never said, so what if you were using at that time, say, CoreOS binaries, and would you consider it vendor, or would you just download those bits and say, I'm using it on my own? Because, so those kind of made it a little unclear for me, saying that, okay, what should I call something that I'm downloading as vendor? We weren't very clear on defining, saying, hey, we are asking you if you're using something that is pre-made and deployed for you on the cloud, or it's a fully baked solution, or are you just downloading stuff that someone else is building so that you don't build it? So those weren't very clear with those data. That's why I think that that wasn't in part of my slides because I wasn't able to derive clearly from that.
Okay, well, we asked a bunch of questions about where people get their binaries.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I actually have a different clarity problem, which is that we had enough different options for where you get your binaries that I think we may have had a certain number of respondees choose relatively arbitrary options, or not choose anything at all because they didn't understand the distinctions between the options. Or the distinctions between the options were meaningless given what they were actually doing. But so it depends, right? I think that where you get your binaries information, I think we have enough information if we're just using that data to correlate it with other things, right? For me to say, hey, I want to do a vendor versus, self-build split for looking at the 12-month horizon. If, we're trying to do an analysis of where people are getting their Kubernetes in general, I think there were some problems with the questions that I asked. I think the problems are different than what Dewal thinks, but I think we agree that those questions are problematic enough to not have clear signal.
So I think I have homogenized some of the data. We can Zoom later or do it together. I can, because I've done this too. Why should both of us do it? So maybe we can talk later also about how.
I think it's interesting for multiple of us to dig at it because we question it differently and we search it. I mean, we've got I think it's like 40,000 cell spreadsheet. Like there's a ton of data there and a lot of different dimensions across which you can start slicing it. So the set of questions people are asking, I think, are useful.
Okay, I've thrown this in a Postgres database. Is there anybody else here who's comfortable with that environment and would like direct access to it? If that's the case, then I'll put that on a cloud instance so that I can actually share. Otherwise, I'll just keep it on my machine.
My data was homogenized in a pandas friendly format. So Python pandas.
I have a question. What is the intended significance? What do you expect to draw from the question of vendor versus upstream versus self-built binaries?
One of the basic questions here, I think, is, does anybody want this from the community? Is it already satisfied from vendors?
Well, the reason I say that is I know that as a vendor, we prefer longer support upstream because we don't want to diff and figure out if patches can be back applied and so on. So our users are going to report that they are using vendor builds, but they benefit from the fact that upstream is updating because, being resource constrained, we'd rather work on the things that are our differentiation than things that upstream can fix. So I think it kind of clouds the data somewhat.
Yeah, I think we actually discussed this in the last SIG release meeting. And that's actually something that would be good for this work group to do, is to talk one-on-one with a lot of the vendors we're familiar with. Because in discussion, it turns out that depending on the vendor, their attitude towards upstream patches is actually very different. Because some vendors are building directly based on the patches that are released by the project, and other vendors are cherry picking. And for the vendors who are cherry picking, they don't care so much what's officially supported. But the vendors who are consuming the patches directly, they do care. And we don't know what that split is right now. We know that we have some vendors doing each of those things, and we don't have a good idea of how many vendors land on each side of that.
Thanks, guys.
So I don't know if somebody wanted to volunteer to do that, by the way.
I think we have different vendors here, so we can actually get some representation in this
The two
meeting
people
directly.
just talking clearly were, so we have Susan Red Hat represented. I think that some of this is kind of confusing maybe too, because there's a little bit different skewing of the provider side here. Like in the Linux distro world, there's the distro and that's that, but there's also the hosted version. So Google's a distribution in a way. It's not distributed out to the customer to install, but it's in the act of vending and running a SaaS, you are making your own distribution behind the scenes. And that from the user perspective, maybe it's slightly similar, but it's sort of behind the curtain how the sausage is made. So to summarize what I heard there, Josh, you feel like from a Red Hat side, the model is to maintain your own support branches. Roger, from a SUSE side, you would probably prefer not to. Who else do we have here? So from a VMware perspective, I think our tendency is to want to be as close to upstream as possible. Jordan, is there anything you could mention from a Google perspective?
Yeah, I mean, we have our own builds, but we track upstream, and so it is beneficial to us for those upstream branches to be maintained. So yeah, I mean, I think the vendor built binary thing, like if you say kube control version and it spits out a version, and that the version of the server has like a vendor specific tag, so you're running, 1.16.2 dash VMware and then the build date or something like that. Like you're running a vendor binary, but it can also be tracking upstream.
Yeah, it's a question of how the binaries are composed, right? Are they consuming like the full patch releases from upstream, or are they cherry picking?
Sure. Yeah.
Individual commits.
But yeah, the GKE builds pull in the upstream point releases.
Okay. Might be worth Tim verifying that with the VMware folks, what they're doing.
We are trying to be fully upstream. I think that for any vendor, even if you're tracking the upstream for anything, whether it's gRPC or etcd or Kubernetes, you're liable on occasion to have something that was a critical fix for a customer and you pull it in while you're hoping to still get that worked upstream. But I think the split in philosophy there would be to one, track upstream and then minimize the difference, or full on maintain your own support branch.
Right, and it's a question of like whether someone can look at a vendor build and say, oh, well, this is 116.3. I know that it contains everything upstream 116.3 had, plus maybe critical local fixes or particular tweaks, like to change the build version or something like that. But it's the ability to reason about if the open source project releases a fix and it's in 116.3. and I look at my vendor binary and it says 116.3 dash some vendor suffix. Do I actually have all the fixes from the open source 116.3? Like that's the primary consideration in my mind.
Yeah, I think as an operator, when I looked at any of those versions, if I had 1.16.3, I always assumed 1.16.3 all patches upstream are in there. And then if there is a vendor name, I would say, okay, maybe built by this person or something extra is there. So that's the notion I would get if I would look at it. As an operator, that's how I used to at least guarantee that, hey, this issues, this bugs, and the security patches are part of it. Again, I think I wanted to also say that the KEP is trying to do minimal things rather than focus on all the questions. Something I felt that with the survey is that the survey was having so many questions and so many sub-questions and so many dimensions to its data that it was very difficult to always get out a point answer to any question. there were some very good outliers, but most of the questions were like, okay, we need like 10 different questions, filter based on them. And then even after that, you had like this, was this question well understood? Was it well worded? Did people really understand this? When I read it, this question, this question means different to me right now. So yeah. That's why I think the KEP was trying to be minimal, saying, okay, just talk about yearly support period. I mean, it initially had skip upgrades, right? So we did not want skip upgrades. We agreed as a group, and it's not part of it because we want to have it minimally changing something and, take an action item from the working group. Seems like it convinced everyone. Everyone's very quiet.
So maybe there it's reasonable to move on to talking about what's been drafted in the KEP. I think we had 2 weeks ago hoped to be further along on that. Dwal and I did a fair amount of wordsmithing, tidying up in the intro portions on it. I'm not sure if others have read those. Quentin, in particular, you were suggesting, I think rightfully, that we tighten that up much more clearly. Have you had a chance to look at it?
Yeah, I've actually just been reading about it during the previous conversation and adding some comments. I think it's vastly improved. I think it's actually great now. I mean, it's still, the other thing that I think lack is some of the kind of concrete background that informed this kind of movement. But I think at least it gives a very good context as to why we're doing this and what we're trying to achieve and the mechanics of what seems to be required. So I think it's great.
That reminds me, kind of lost in these other conversations, we had been talking about breaking that background detail into a year-end summary doc. And that one, I think, has stagnated the editing on it. I think if we can separate the two out, one that's a good bookend for the year for the working group, and then I feel like it would declutter the KEP. I think most KEPs don't end up having all of the conversation that led to the KEP directly in it, but sort of reference off to other existing artifacts. I like that split, but I don't know what others feel.
Yeah, I totally agree. I don't think we want to clutter up the KEP with a whole bunch of background, but we do want to link to it for people who want to understand the context.
Yeah, a table of references at the bottom is what a lot of things do.
And I think we still have a lot of details in this KEP that we don't need here, because from the KEP's perspective, it needs to only define that. It needs to be the pivot to other changes.
I mean, you want to be clear enough in the motivation and goals, rather than jumping right into we will do X, Y, and Z. But I agree that it could be summarized and then have references out to full discussions or full backing data.
And we have to seek feedback from other SIGs and make changes. But those changes would be in implementing these sub-KEPs. I think the other KEPs, like if you're changing the versions queue, if you're changing the version queue, then that would be a separate KEP versus that should be something addressed in this KEP.
Yeah, so one thing that I have on my list for next week at KubeCon is to start shopping around this idea with different groups. So the ones that I'm focused mostly on are SIGArch with the SKU policies, SIGNode, because that's probably the most complex component with the biggest SKU that we have, and SIG-CLI. Because we would like to improve the client-side compatibility so that you don't have to sort of pick a middle version to deal with a bunch of different server versions. So those are the three groups that I plan to start having these conversations with. If other people are going to be involved with other groups, maybe scheduling or network or like some of the other areas, just keep this in the back of your mind as a conversation to have. and start seeding the idea and saying this is in the works, and we'll probably start asking for formal feedback maybe after KubeCon.
The version skew area is one of the things that I was trying to decide, like going back to that idea of, do we keep this as simple as possible and just focus on the support claim? Could we leave the version skew portion off?
It kind of doesn't work with the support statement that is existing right now that extends to say, okay, we support this many months, and then here is how the version queue support us. So it kind of goes hand in hand. That's why every time this question came in, it felt like, okay, we may have to extend it. Let's go and talk to the SIGs.
Yeah, I think so the question, if we lengthen support, the question becomes, all right, so now you have a cluster that is at the end of its support window, and used to be that meant that you had 2 version skew, and now you need to upgrade stuff. And so like you could upgrade every 3 releases and get away, and function. And when you did that upgrade, you would bring all your old kubelets up to date and then upgrade and do the next step.
But implicit within that is that you're going to upgrade in place. Like if we're just talking about improving support, could we improve support for a running cluster that then is evacuated, whatever? Like could we truly separate out upgrade into next conversations?
I think the idea that the oldest kubelet we support doesn't work with the newest API server we support, when that has always been the case previously, is if we widen support without also widening that statement, I think that will be very hard to recover from. I don't think we would easily get back to a point where we pushed kubelet support back out to the oldest version. The primary place that this shows up is how quickly we can make changes or make assumptions in the API server. So if you're planning a rollout of a new feature, how quickly can you start enforcing something or requiring something, knowing that all supported kubelets are at least as new as X?
I still think we're kind of making an assumption about how people, like if I think really abstractly about workload on top of running cluster at a version, and that workload is going to end up on top of a cluster at a newer version, how that change is affected, whether the cluster is upgraded iteratively underneath the workload, or whether the workloads are moved over to a totally different cluster via tools outside of the core. Like it is, I feel like that's somewhat fraught today. The user is going to get some level of feedback as they iteratively upgrade within a new version range. The feedback would happen. So say their CRD has become broken, or they're depending on some feature that is no longer present. That feedback is going to get shifted right if we don't do something, and that's generally a bad thing. But it's also, I feel like it's perhaps fairly right today anyway, even wanting it to be further left. Like I'm starting to imagine, I think this came up in the last couple of meetings, I'm starting to imagine that these could almost be viewed as orthogonal, and that could simplify the discussion in the short term. I think we still have to solve this problem.
Yeah, I'm having a hard time following I'm having a hard time following what you're saying.
So maybe to make it like super abstract, I'm running 112 on AWS, and I'm gonna forklift my workload to 116 on GCP or GKE. Where does API server compatibility become an issue for me?
Well, anything that interacts with API servers. So that's all your custom controllers, all your CRDs, all of your client applications, all your UIs, any custom stuff that you've
So
done.
today I would have to kind of late in having made the decision maybe to try such a major change, I'd have to have some way that I have devised myself to validate that I will be able to do this and fix up my stuff.
Yeah, in that case, you basically have two internally coherent working clusters at whatever version they're at.
Yeah.
And that's fine. But I'm not sure we're talking about the same thing. I guess.
Well, and I'm wondering, like, how many people focus on just having internally coherent clusters and are happy there? We don't have data that says, or are we pushing out a harder problem that maybe users care less about than we do?
Well, we definitely have users in both camps. Some
Yes.
Every time they change, spin up a new cluster, move stuff over, burn the old one to the ground at the cluster level. That's fine. We also definitely have lots of people that upgrade in place. And if we're going to do the work to broaden support, it would be nice if it could serve both groups of users, so that people who currently upgrade their clusters every 9 months in place could then upgrade their clusters every 12, 13 months in place. And the ones who are keeping old clusters around and spinning up new ones and burning the old ones to the ground, they don't have to do that as frequently if they don't want to.
So it could be sufficient to not have that nice thing, perhaps, but it also maybe then is a regression because they can do it today.
It complicates the explanation. Like, as the person who put the SKU document upgrade order thing in place and answers questions every day from people actually building Kubernetes about, like, am I allowed to do this? When can I break this? How long do I have to wait to do this? Having the answer be, well, if you're upgrading this way, you do it this, and if you're upgrading that way, you do it that. Like, it's really helpful to have really clear, consistent answers that are the same everywhere, and then let people with different deployment upgrade situation.
We just did our first upgrade that quote could not unquote be done in place. I'll explain the air quotes in a moment. And found that, I don't know, somewhere around 90% of our customers were cool with that, 90 to 95. But the 5 to 10 who weren't, we needed some extraordinary measures. What we did, I put that in quotes, what we did was we actually had fallen so far behind in our process that we just skipped from 110 to 115 and said, okay, folks, you're going to have to spin up something new. And for a small subset of our customers, we had to build intermediate releases and have service folks go do the upgrades for them, because they were, by God, going to do it in place. And so
I will say on the survey, rolling in place upgrade is the single most popular option.
Yeah, so if you look at the data, I think in place upgrades was the biggest one. I think I have I don't know if it's in the slides yet, but I think I got some data last week, so I can put it up.
Yeah. So,
also,
so that 90 to 95% kind of, even they would rather have done it in place. They just kind of gritted their teeth and said, okay, just promise me you're not going to do this to me again next year. But the guys who didn't go for it strongly didn't go for it.
Yeah, there's also degrees of in place, right? So a common pattern is to roll the control plane up, keeping all your nodes the same.
Yeah.
Get your control plane up to the version you want, do that in place, and then basically do the spin up a new node pool at the version you want and just drain old nodes and delete them and let the new nodes take capacity. So that's a pattern that I see a lot, and that's actually pretty minimally disruptive. Like rolling a control plane, it's three nodes probably, but if you're needing to roll all your worker nodes, that's really disruptive. And so not supporting the oldest kubelet against the newest API server would require you to do an intermediate node pool drain and upgrade.
And the data says in place HA roll upgrades, so
just
the highest part.
Do customers who do the burn down option, so they have they have the application running in one cluster, and then they deploy it into a new cluster, and then they switch the traffic over and all that kind of stuff. Do they manage, the ones who are reasonably okay with that model, do they manage to do it without downtime? Or do they just say, oh, we're okay doing like a maintenance shutdown for however long that switchover takes?
If I remember correctly, they didn't end up coming to the public meeting. We'd had just a couple of us chatting with them, but JP Morgan Chase was willing to publicly go on the record of saying that they do the bigger roles across clusters, not in place successfully without downtime. They're all about repaving immutable infrastructure. And then
it's possible, it's just hard.
Well, yeah, and I feel like there we have kind of the early adoptees who, you go back 2 years, say, they had to build all of this themselves. And they did, and they've had time for it to mature, and they're happy and successful with it. But then there's everybody else, especially the newer adoptees.
And I think as your size of your cluster grows, having 2 clusters is tougher. If you have a beefy 100 node cluster, then you probably, I'm just calling 100 nodes as big. But if you have 100 node cluster, having another 100 node cluster just for doing upgrades is gonna be tough. Plus, it depends on how you treat the cluster. Is your cluster a platform where you're pushing services as apps, or cluster itself is a solution? So your CRDs running in there versus services, independent services running in there. But I think from the data we see that in place HA rolling upgrades is the biggest user base there.
Yeah, from my experience, when I was at Atlassian and we'd been doing it for like 4 years or something like that, we always did in-place upgrades for everything, but we had the facility to throw away clusters and redo them, but it was almost never worth the hassle, because rolling the control plane and then issuing please upgrade my node pools commands with reasonably strict was far more straightforward than trying to cut traffic between things.
Yeah, the big problem comes with the data transfer. Like if you're serving traffic in the one cluster, and then you've got to like stop time, move all the data across, and then start again. It's possible, but difficult to do that without an outage.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's to say nothing of also you might end up with a surprising bill for data transfer costs, depending on your cloud provider.
Yeah, if the clusters are in the same AZ, then most of them, that's reasonably free. But yeah, in theory, it could be more problematic.
And I guess, so I just kind of typed this in the chat. I was trying to sort of devil's advocate, like listen to some of the voices who are saying, like, is there something simpler we could do? What is the minimal increment to start something? And I am personally fairly sold, like the type of stuff Jordan was talking about on the user experience there. And I think it makes sense to elongate the version queue, but I'm sort of like imagining the questions as we start socializing the KEP a little bit more, but why did we have to elongate the skew? Like why did we make the choice to do this? Why did we make the choice to do that? And to have some of those things a little bit more spoken out loud, thought about trade-offs.
It's also worth noting that I don't think we need to elongate it for everything. So the kubelet API server skew and the kube control API server skew are the two that seem the most important here. all the pieces that make up the control plane being within a version of each other still seems reasonable. Like doing those upgrades of a piece, working through the versions, getting your control plane up to date. But the kube control, just from a user perspective, not losing their mind if they need to have 3 or 4 versions of kube control around just to work with their servers, and then kubelets so they don't have to drain and migrate expensive node pools step by step.
Yeah, I think there is already kind of a mess on the client side where people are probably used to some extent having to manage different versions of Golang tools, different YAML configs for the clusters that they talk to, but you throw in the kubectl binary also into that, then you start getting a very multi-dimensional equation where it would be hard for the users to turn the knob to the right frequency to talk to a given server.
Yeah, kube control itself has gotten a lot better in the last several releases. We depend on far fewer internal things, and so it is sort of just a normal API client. It's pretty much completely switched to using API methods that don't drop data about unknown fields. So it's just a pass-through of manifests to API server, and then whatever the API server gives me back, I display it. So we're actually in a much better place now than we were 2 years ago, with kube control being able to support a wider range of servers, which is great.
Jordan, a quick question. This concept of like internal clients and external clients, that's been argued fairly energetically by Brian, particularly that distinction should not exist. And I'm very behind I don't know what the current status is, but I would imagine that it's pretty difficult to draw that distinction as soon as you have, CRDs and custom controllers and other stuff in your cluster. It's not part of the Kubernetes release, and
Yeah.
So is it worth drawing that distinction, or can we strictly say there is only one type of API client, they're all the same?
So the particular thing that was being used, all API clients are external clients. Everything that talks to the wire uses the external API.
Including the nodes?
Yeah, oh yeah. Nodes, scheduler, controller manager, kube control, everything. What got built sort of accidentally, so internally, in memory, the API server deals with a common version. So if it's serving multiple versions of something,
it switches everything.
3 different versions, it converts those to an in-memory representation that's the same. Other things in the tree started doing the same thing because they had access to those conversion methods and those internal types. So kube control, when it was printing out like nice human readable versions of things, it said, you know what, no matter what version of a deployment you get, I'm going to convert it to this common internal version and then display it. And so it took dependencies on conversions and information that logically only belonged to the API server itself.
Yeah.
So that's what we've gotten rid of. We've deleted those converting clients. We've ripped all that out of kube control. That's what I'm talking about.
But so given that, maybe I'm being dumb, but just clarify this distinction between internal clients and external clients. I thought there was therefore no distinction between the two.
It's a question of, so when it talks to the server, it uses external APIs. The question is, what does it do with that data once it gets it in memory? Does it round trip it through its own snapshot point in time conversion?
I understand that, yeah. And if we get rid of all of that stuff, then do we still have 2 different kinds of clients? I mean, you started off the conversation by saying some types of clients can be in lockstep with API server, Delta 1, and others we need to support 3 or 4 or whatever it is, 1 year's worth of change.
Right.
Does that distinction exist, or is that?
It's at that point, it's less about internal, external, and more about just coordination between the two. If you add a feature to the controller manager, and it's assuming that the scheduler is also aware of that feature, and it can set a field and throw the object over to the scheduler, and the scheduler will do same things with that, then that's where you start needing to have guarantees about, like, I can assume this feature is on in the scheduler. I can assume the scheduler is at least as new as some version.
Yeah.
So it's less about the like the data transfer and more about, it's a distributed system. And so if you're going to rely on some other component to actuate something that you're doing, then you need to know that component's at least new enough to know that feature exists.
Yeah.
We saw this when we switched daemon sets to going through the scheduler instead of being scheduled directly by the controller, so that they could start taking advantage of like node resources and port allocation and things like that. That took several releases to roll out because the controller was going to switch from directly assigning daemon set pods to nodes to saying, all right, here's scheduler, you manage this and take resource allocation into account. But we had to wait a couple of releases for the scheduler to have that in there.
Yeah.
So we're getting towards the end of the hour. Are there any other comments folks want to make on the on that support KEP, or could we get a little bit of a status update on the conformance KEP that Jordan's been working on?
I can give a quick update. There's not a lot there. The initial proposal merged. People were happy with it. There weren't any major issues. So the ability to turn off beta features and APIs in at least one CI conformance job is in progress. That will let us understand all of the current dependencies we have on anything that's beta level, temporarily whitelist those while we work on graduating, progressing, removing those dependencies, whatever the case may be. And it will prevent new dependencies from creeping in accidentally. There was a follow-up request to also allow identifying things that are GA but are not required by conformance, things like RBAC, any dependencies that conformance tests have accidentally taken on optional GA features. That will be a follow-up after the initial beta aspects. That's the beta dependencies are more urgent to resolve. So I linked a couple things that are in progress. This probably won't make it in for 117, but that's okay. We're still making progress on it. But I expect to have the ability to run conformance jobs with beta stuff turned off to come in early in 118 dev cycle. And I should clarify, to run with beta things turned off, except for specific things we identify as being problems that we will then go work on resolve.
I really like that pattern. Like there's so much, it's maybe a little negative to call it technical debt, but there's so much that's just the way that it is because it's the way that it is. And getting in and cataloging stuff and figuring out how to start incrementally scraping things off to a better state with the goal explicit in a test case is
right. And preventing accidents. Like a lot of the things that are here weren't intentionally done. They just, we enable beta APIs in default configurations, and then you go write a test and you use the tools you have, and you don't necessarily realize that you're depending on something that's not stable GA level. And then the test gets promoted to conformance, and before you know it, like these accidents build on each other. And so, people aren't trying to do the wrong thing. This will just make it clear, oh, you can't do that in a conformance test.
Yeah, and there's probably a fair amount of cargo culting that goes on as well. People take existing stuff and they just copy it.
Yeah. This will also be good motivation to, bring to GA the APIs that we consider so critical and important to actually setting up a cluster that, every tool that we have uses them. It's like, maybe we should actually stabilize and graduate this. So top of my list for 118 is the certificate signing request API. That's the one that kubeatom and all the tools, the kubelets, all of them sort of center on this. It's a good coordination point for vendor and cluster specific integrations. And so there's some things we need to work through there, but that's the biggest thing on my list for 118 to get to stable.
And there is the effort to finally bring Ingress to stable as well.
Yeah, that's in progress. They were hoping to get it into 117, but it didn't quite make it.
I think one thing I had a question was on, there's no clarity in the SKU policies, how long something can be in alpha and beta, because we have seen, I mean, something like Ingress, I think everyone's using Ingress today. So what's the, in the future, what's the ideal situation where we say, okay, this long is good for alpha or beta?
Funny you should ask. There's a proposal that's actually very close, that's waiting on a couple last updates, to require APIs to transition out of beta within a certain time frame. I will link this as well. So I just put this in the notes. Sorry, my typing is loud. With the express goal of avoiding things sitting in beta for so long that they become effective, stable APIs that are labeled beta and get adopted everywhere and treated as stable.
And that's also true about alpha.
It's less true about alpha because alpha APIs are not enabled by default. So you have to explicitly opt into running an alpha configuration, whereas beta things, by the time they get to beta, there's a good level of confidence in the feature and the direction, and the goal of beta is to get feedback. And so this tries to walk the line between continuing to enable getting that feedback and exercising the API and making sure we understand the use cases well before we promote it to stable, without letting it linger for so long that it loses momentum or gets neglected, or accumulates so much usage that it becomes almost impossible to graduate or change.
So just skimming through that, is the initial MVP the checklist with humans going through it at each release point, or would there be automation generating lists of things and watching?
For which one?
The require transition from beta, like it's proposed as implementable, but would the implementation be human process or automation backed?
It would be part of the API process. So when a beta version was introduced, like the timeline for that beta API would be established.
But like, is that on your Google Calendar that you'll in 9 months come back and look at the thing, or how's the community get the trigger and 9 months later for each of the in things?
Right. So it would be documented on the API types itself. So when we announce the API, we say, this API is now available. It does X, Y, and Z. It's really cool. Use it. By the way, this is the time frame for this lifetime of this API. And so we're going to get feedback and then either progress to the next beta version with feedback, or progress to GA if all the feedback says, nope, it's perfect, ship it, or deprecate it and remove it if the feedback is this is problematic or doesn't meet some requirement that was fundamental. So the idea is that the difficulty is that we announce beta things and there's all this excitement and documentation like, oh, go try it, it's awesome, adopt it. And then people do that and then forget that they're depending on something that isn't stable yet. And so the goal is to pair that announcement and excitement with a clear timeline of use this, give us feedback, here's when you can expect it to go away.
That makes sense, and that's the first key step then, yeah. and you still got to project manage it.
Yeah.
Later, but yeah.
There are other related things we want to do, like make it more visible when you're using beta APIs, present things to the user in kubectl or via the API, or messages to them. So when you update something or create something that's beta, you get something that pokes you and says, hey, you're using a beta API, just so you know, like here's the time frame, whatever. Figuring out ways to make that more visible is also on our list, but is not required for those.
Would this also extend to the flags and features?
That is less clear. So this was scoped just to the beta APIs to begin with.
Okay, I mean, I like the progress, so.
Yeah,
Does
the APIs are the ones that are the most problematic because people write to them externally. It's a contract with people out in the world that we don't, have great visibility to who is using this, and it's the hardest to change. A flag or a feature, there's immediate feedback to the person administering the cluster. If that goes away or changes, you can give that person feedback very easily.
I did face issues with flags automatically defaulting to true versus false once they become beta. So those are surprises that you wouldn't realize unless you push to production, and after a month you realize, hey, this was turned on. So a future problem to solve for sure.
Yeah, although the proposal that is the one linked above would make it really easy for you to run clusters with everything beta turned off except things you specifically wanted. So
okay,
that is nice for us, making sure conformance doesn't depend on it, but it's also nice for people running stuff in production who don't want to pick up everything beta on every new version. Like, let me start with a stable GA base and then optionally turn on specific things if I want them or need them. So the goal was to give a tool that was actually useful to administrators of clusters as well.
I was just wondering if I understood correctly, it sounds like the proposal is to make that, whatever the right word is, the timeline for betas 9 months. If we were to change the support to annual, is there a need or is it desirable to have this support period of 1 year and that disappearing beta period be the same, or I mean, if only for communication clarity, maybe not for technical reasons.
Yeah, the 9 month thing is a little misleading. At 9 months, it would be announced deprecated and then live for another 2 releases. So it's actually longer than 9 months that the thing would be around. I don't think we want to get, once you start getting into the 18-month, 2-year time frame of an API having been around, you start to see the problems we've seen with Ingress and other perma beta.
No, I agree. I was just wondering if we want to have the complexity of saying some stuff is definitely around and unchanged for 12 months, and other stuff is around for 9 months and then gets deprecated, but actually only disappears after 15 months.
Yeah.
It just becomes...
The original proposal was actually 2 releases. And it's really just, we need long enough to know what the direction is. Are we going to do another beta? Are we going to go to GA? Or are we going to deprecate and remove? And so that time period is intended to give long enough to get some adopters and some feedback and understand.
I understand all that. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you. I fully understand.
Okay.
So the short answer is we're decoupling the 2 time frames explicitly, and they will be different, and there will be some amount of confusion, but we think that's fine.
Yeah, this is much more inside baseball. How long do we need to know? How long do we need to figure out the trajectory of a beta thing? So.
I just posted this on the Slack chat. Sorry, on the Zoom chat. We are out of time.
Okay.
Well, thanks for the discussion again and the clarifications, and I'm looking forward to KubeCon conversations around this, and I will see hopefully most of you there on Monday.
Yep.
Yeah, I'll see you all there on Monday.
See you next.
See you. Bye-bye.